The year was 1883. The month was December, and it had forgotten how to be anything but cruel. Agnes felt the wind through the stitches of her coat, a personal and invasive cold that cared nothing for wool or resolve. Her hands, wrapped in burlap rags, were numb around the rope. The rope was her world. One end was tied to the iron handle of her door. The other was tied around her waist. It was the only thing tethering her to the known universe. Everything else, the sky, the plains, the mountains she knew were there, had been erased by a white violence. Her dog, Kaiser, a great, dark shape of loyalty, pressed against her leg, his body a low and steady anchor in the chaos. The shed roof had collapsed under the snow's impossible weight. She had gone for the last of the split logs. Now, she was pulling herself back, hand over frozen hand, a blind navigator following a lifeline to the only solid thing left on earth. The wind screamed a sermon of oblivion in her ears, and under it, a man's voice, a memory from a warmer season. A wooden house is a coffin, woman. A stone house is a tomb. What you're building is a fool's monument to both. Inside her cabin, behind a pane of salvaged glass set deep into the stone, 3 tomatoes hung from a vine. They were small, but they were red. And they were growing in the dead of winter. We tell stories of survival, but often miss the quiet work that precedes it. Tell us, where are you watching from tonight? Agnes had always been a student of things that did not speak. Before her husband, Jacob, had been taken by the fever 2 winters prior, he had understood this in her. He was a quiet man who saw the set of her jaw when she watched a storm front move across the plains, the way she would crumble different kinds of soil between her fingers, her eyes distant. While other husbands brought back bolts of calico or sacks of candy from town, Jacob brought Agnes books. Not novels or Bibles. He brought her a government pamphlet on the geology of the territory, a worn almanac from a decade past, a thin volume on Roman engineering with half the pages missing. He never asked what she learned. He just saw that when she read, some deep and unsettled part of her grew still. After his death, this stillness was mistaken for arrogance. Her quiet observation was seen as idleness. The small community of Prairie Ridge, a place built on the loud and urgent work of settlement, had no category for a widow who spent an afternoon watching the way frost formed on the north face of a boulder. They saw a woman untethered from sense, lost in a grief that had curdled her mind. Work, in their world, was visible and immediate, plowing, mending, churning, praying. Agnes's work was invisible. She was mapping the forces that governed their lives, forces they themselves only ever endured. She noted the path of the prevailing wind, how it scoured the earth bare on one side of her small claim and piled drifts as high as a man on the other. She studied the angle of the winter sun, a weak and distant god, charting its low arc across the sky with sticks pressed into the frozen ground. The world's rejection was not a single, dramatic event. It was a slow, systemic turning away. It was the women of the church circle, who stopped inviting her to quilt, their needles a flurry of prescribed industry she could not join. It was the men who offered to work her land for a share of a non-existent crop, their eyes lingering on the cabin, on the deed they knew she held. The town's consensus was articulated perfectly one Sunday by the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was as sharp and thin as her nose. Standing on the church steps, she had looked toward Agnes's small cabin, a curl of smoke the only sign of life, and said to a small group of listeners, "Grief does strange things to a woman's mind. Best leave her to her rocks and her prayers, though I suspect she's more familiar with the rocks." The inciting event had been their offer of charity, which felt more like a verdict. Mr. Davies, the owner of the general store and the town's unofficial patriarch, had led the delegation. They proposed she sell her claim, Jacob's claim, for a pittance. They would give her a room at the back of the church, a small, dark space where other widows had gone to fade into quiet servitude. She would be cared for, they said. She would be safe. Agnes had listened, her hands folded in her lap, Kaiser's head resting on her knee. When they finished, she said only one word. No, the word was not angry. It was not defiant. It was a simple statement of fact, like naming a type of stone. From that day, the isolation was complete. She was no longer a widow to be pitied, but a problem to be ignored. It was in that profound silence, with only the wind and the dog for company, that she picked up her first stone. The winter after Jacob died, before the stones, was a lesson in how a house could betray you. The cabin was a simple thing of pine logs, built quickly and cheaply, meant as a temporary shelter on the way to something better. But Jacob's death had made it permanent. And it was failing. The wind, that same wind Agnes had studied, was now her tormentor. It found every chink in the daubing, every gap between the ill-fitting logs. It slid under the door and through the window frame, a constant, whining intruder that stole warmth as fast as she could make it. She and Kaiser spent most of their days huddled by the small iron stove, a hungry god that devoured her dwindling woodpile. The cold was not a sensation. It was an entity. It lived in the floorboards and settled deep in her bones, an ache that sleep could not erase. She wore all her clothes at once, layers of wool and cotton that did little to stop the shivering. Shivering, she had read in a medical text, was the body's desperate attempt to generate heat. It was a sign of the fight. She began to fear the moment the shivering would stop. Her fingers would burn with cold, then go numb, then become foreign objects at the ends of her hands. At night, the cabin groaned around her, the wood contracting with audible reports like pistol shots in the dark. Each sound was a reminder of her fragility, of the thin wooden membrane separating her from a world that wanted her frozen. There were days when her mind grew slow and dull, the world seen through a fog of cold and low-grade hunger. She rationed her food with a ruthless precision, counting out beans, measuring flour by the spoonful. The thought of giving up was not a dramatic temptation. It was a quiet, logical whisper in the long nights. She would lie under a mountain of blankets and quilts, Kaiser a warm weight against her back, and think of the room behind the church. She could picture it. The smell of mothballs and old hymnals. The certainty of a bowl of warm, lumpy oatmeal in the morning. She considered the walk to town, the act of knocking on Mr. Davies's door. The surrender. She imagined the relief of letting go, of handing her failure over to others to manage. This is where it ends, she thought one night, the cold a heavy blanket on her chest. Not with a struggle, but with a quiet closing of a door. But something pulled her back. It was not a prayer, not a memory of Jacob's face. It was a sentence, surfacing from the tattered book on Roman engineering. The arch supports the weight by redirecting the force. The thought was clinical, impersonal. It had nothing to do with hope or courage. It was a puzzle. She lay in the dark, not thinking of survival, but of physics. The wind was a force. A pressure. Her cabin was meeting it head-on, resisting it, and breaking under the strain. What if it didn't have to resist? What if the force could be redirected? The practical problem seized her mind and shook it awake. She did not get up filled with new resolve. She got up because she had an idea to examine. That spring, as the ground thawed, she began to walk the land not for firewood, but for rock. She needed stone that was flat, solid, something that could be stacked. Her search led her away from the open plains and into the low, rolling hills at the edge of her claim. She was following a deer trail, noticing how it dipped into a draw that was surprisingly green when she felt it. A change in the air. The wind, which had been a constant companion, simply stopped. The silence was profound. She pushed through a thicket of stubborn, winter-brown brush and found the source. It was not a cave, not really. It was a deep rock overhang, a wide, shallow mouth in a limestone outcrop, facing south. The air inside was still and damp. And a trickle of water, clear and constant, seeped from a fissure in the rock, running down its face and disappearing into the dark, rich soil of the cave floor. She dipped her fingers in it. It was shockingly not frozen. It wasn't warm, but it was liquid. It was life. She stood there for a long time, the silence of the place seeping into her. Kaiser sniffed at the damp earth, his tail giving a slow, tentative wag. Agnes knelt and pressed her palm flat against the ground. It was just cold earth, but it felt different. It felt possible. This was the gift the land was offering. Not comfort. Not safety. but a set of materials and a truth she could use. She sat on the cold stone floor and felt a feeling for which she had no word. It was not relief. It was not joy. It was recognition. It was the feeling of an engineer seeing the perfect stone for a keystone. It was the feeling of finding the beginning. The work began with a tool she made. She took the cracked head of Jacob's old mining sledge and lashed it to a thick branch of cartonwood with strips of wet rawhide. As the rawhide dried, it tightened into a bond as strong as iron. This became her hammer, used to break larger pieces of limestone she quarried from the hills. The sound of steel on rock became the new rhythm of her days. It was slow, punishing labor. Each stone was a victory measured in sweat and aching muscles. To move them, she built a traver, 2 long poles hitched to Kaiser's sturdy shoulders. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the work, leaning into the harness, his paws digging into the earth as he helped her drag the heavy stone sleds back to the cabin. He was not a pet. He was a partner. She was not a mason. Her first attempts at building the wall were clumsy. The stones wouldn't sit right. The small, unstable piles she made would collapse overnight. She returned to her books, reading about mortar, about bonding agents. The Roman book mentioned volcanic ash. She had no volcano, but she had a fire pit. She began to experiment, mixing the fine clay she found near the limestone spring with sand from the creek bed and the gray, sifted ash from her stove. She made dozens of small batches, testing them, letting them dry in the sun, breaking them apart to see which held the strongest. Finally, she found a mixture that cured as hard as cement. With her crude mortar, the wall began to rise. It was not a pretty thing. It was a thick, utilitarian shell, a stone fortress built directly against the outer pine logs of her cabin. She left a gap of a few inches between the wood and the stone, an idea that came to her in the night. The air trap between the walls, she reasoned, would be a barrier. It would not be warm, but it would be still. The wind could beat against the stone, but it could not touch the wood. The stone wall would take the force. It would redirect it. She built the south-facing wall first, the one that received the most of the weak winter sun. Into this wall, she set her prize, a small, intact window she had scavenged from a burnt-out stagecoach she'd found in a ravine. The glass was thick and warped, but it was whole. She mortared it carefully into the stone, creating a small, sheltered space against the inner wooden wall. This was to be her laboratory. The first proof of her theory came not from the warmth of the cabin, but from the earth itself. She remembered the dark, damp soil on the floor of the limestone cave. It was alive, even in winter. Over many trips, she hauled buckets of it back to the cabin. Behind the salvaged window, in the sun-warmed space between the walls, she built a shallow planting box. In it, she placed the cave soil and the last of her saved tomato seeds. It was an act of faith, not in a god, but in geology. For weeks, nothing happened. Then, one morning in deepest January, a day when the air outside was so cold it hurt to breathe, she saw it. A tiny speck of green. 2 small leaves unfurling from the dark soil. The plant was pale and spindly, but it was growing. She tended to it with a fierce devotion, watering it with melted snow. In February, a small, yellow flower bloomed. And then, a tiny green orb appeared. She watched it every day as it slowly swelled and blushed with color. The first tomato ripened on a gray, windswept afternoon. It was no bigger than a hen's egg, and its skin was slightly tough. She sliced it in half with her knife. She ate one half, the taste of summer a shocking explosion in her mouth. The other half she gave to Kaiser, who licked it up with a gentle curiosity. It was more than food. It was evidence. It was a verdict on her sanity. Her first human visitor was a man the town considered an outcast himself. Jedediah was an old prospector who had spent more of his life in the company of mountains than of men. He appeared one afternoon at the edge of her clearing, drawn not by smoke, but by the sight of her impossible house. He was lean and weathered, his eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. He looked at the thick, uneven stone wall, then at Agnes. He did not mock. He did not question. He simply tilted his head and asked, his voice a dry rasp, "Limestone spring nearby?" He knew. He had seen formations like this before, places where the earth breathed a different climate. He recognized the type of stone she was using, the specific clay in her mortar. He saw not madness, but a deep and practical understanding of the land. He did not offer to help her build, he recognized the work was hers alone. Instead, he offered knowledge. He showed her a patch of reeds by the creek whose hollowed stalks, dried and fitted together, could create a pipe. He explained how to site a small ditch, following the contour of the land, to channel the seep from the cave down to a larger cold frame she could build against the south wall. He spoke of the way different rocks held the day's heat, releasing it slowly through the night. He was the first person since Jacob to speak her language. He saw her not as a grieving widow, but as a fellow engineer. The community's conversion began not with understanding, but with need. Mr. Davies, in his store, saw her buying supplies she shouldn't need, more seeds, lamp oil, salt. Throwing good money after bad fantasies, he muttered to another customer, loud enough for her to hear. The story of the widow's rock pile became a piece of town folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of solitude and grief. The first crack in their certainty came from a trapper. He was passing through and bought a small, cloth-wrapped bundle of dried herbs from a basket on Davies's counter. Agnes had grown them in her window box, basil and thyme that smelled of a sunnier world. Days later, the trapper returned, seeking out Davies. The herbs, he declared, were the most potent he'd ever tasted. He wanted to know who grew them. Davies, perplexed, could only point toward the hills. The whispers grew louder when Jedediah, on one of his rare visits to town, traded a small pouch of gold dust not for whiskey or bacon, but for a basket of pale green lettuce and spinach Agnes had brought in. In the middle of March, with the ground still frozen solid, Jedediah sat on the porch of the general store and ate a salad. The sight was so strange, so impossible, it stopped conversations. Mr. Davies watched from his doorway, his face a mask of disbelief. The final shift came quietly, without ceremony. The Miller family, their two youngest children sick with the winter cough that never seemed to leave, were desperate. Their boy was pale and weak. Remembering the stories of the widow's garden, Mrs. Miller sent her oldest son on the long walk to Agnes's cabin. He arrived, nervous and cold, and stammered out his mother's request for any greens she could spare. Agnes listened, then went inside. She returned with a basket filled with lettuce, chard, and a handful of small, sweet carrots pulled from a deep bed of sand and cave soil in her root cellar. She did not ask for payment. The boy ran all the way home. The Millers did not speak of it publicly, but they came back the next week, and the week after that. Hunger, it turned out, was a more powerful force than ridicule. Then came the blizzard of 1883. It arrived without warning, a white wall that descended from the north and swallowed the world. It was not a storm, it was a siege. For 3 days it raged, piling snow into drifts that buried fences, sheds, and the first floors of houses. The wind was a physical force, a battering ram that tested every nail and every log in Prairie Ridge. Inside her stone cocoon, Agnes was safe. The wind howled and screamed against the outer stone wall, but inside, the air was still. The cabin was not warm. It was a constant, cellar-cool temperature, but it was a livable cold. The wind could not get in. Kaiser slept peacefully by the stove, which burned with a slow, steady economy of which she no longer feared exhausting. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The silence that followed was as absolute as the noise had been. The world was a uniform, blinding white under a pale, indifferent sun. Agnes knew the town would be in trouble. Their hastily built cabins, their profligate use of firewood, their reliance on a supply wagon that was now surely lost, it was a formula for disaster. Late that afternoon, she saw them. A line of dark figures struggling through the deep snow, moving slowly toward her cabin. It was a party of men from the town, led by Mr. Davies. They looked like explorers in a barren, Arctic land, exhausted and half-frozen. When they finally reached her door, they were leaning on each other for support. Mr. Davies stood before her, his face grey with cold and exhaustion. The arrogance was gone. The certainty he wore like a second coat had been stripped from him. He looked smaller, older, a man who had met a force far greater than his own opinion. Agnes opened her door, and Kaiser rose to stand beside her, a silent, watchful presence. The air that flowed out of her cabin was cool, but it was still. It did not bite. Davies opened his mouth to speak, to stammer out the request he had rehearsed for 3 agonizing miles, but she spoke first. Her voice was calm, even. How many families are without? It was not the question he expected. It held no accusation, no triumph. It was a logistical inquiry. He was so taken aback it took him a moment to answer. He told her of the dwindling food, the sickness, the cold that was seeping into every home. He did not have to describe the fear. It was etched on his face. Agnes simply nodded. She led them inside. She showed them her root cellar, a small door in the floor leading to a space dug deep into the earth beneath the cabin. It was packed with potatoes, carrots, turnips, and squash. Shelves lined the dirt walls, holding hundreds of jars of preserved beans, corn, and tomatoes. She showed them the inner room, where her cold frames, lit by the salvaged glass, were still producing a slow but steady supply of green, living food. She did not speak of her foresight. She did not mention their mockery. She simply calculated what she could spare. It was more than they had dared to hope for. She packed sacks and boxes, giving them instructions on how to distribute it, how to make it last. As they prepared to leave, their crude sleds now laden with life, Mr. Davies paused at the door. He struggled for a moment, the apology he knew he owed her caught in his throat. He could not say it. The words would not form. Instead, he reached inside his heavy coat. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book with a faded cover. It was Jacob's book on geology. The one he had borrowed a year ago and claimed to have lost. He held it out to her. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice low. It was all he could manage. It was not an apology, but it was an admission. It was the return of a stolen tool to its rightful master. Agnes took the book. Her fingers traced the worn title. She looked from the book to his face, then out at the vast, white landscape. "The ground holds more warmth than the wind," she said. It was a statement of fact she had read in that very book. It was an observation about the world. And it was the only absolution he would ever receive. Decades passed. Agnes never left her cabin. It became a landmark, a place of learning. The stone walls, once a symbol of her madness, were now seen as a monument to her wisdom. She taught anyone who came to ask, young couples starting their own homesteads, farmers tired of losing their crops to early frosts. She taught them about thermal mass, about siting a home to work with the sun and wind, not against them. She taught them what the land would give, if you only knew how to listen. The town of Prairie Ridge survived. It grew. And it changed. New homes were built with stone foundations. Cold frames became a common sight. Her methods, born of isolation and observation, became their common sense. She died on a bright spring afternoon, sitting in her chair by the window, the geology book open in her lap. She was old, her face a map of seasons. A descendant of Kaiser, another great shepherd, lay sleeping at her feet. The sound of a neighbor's children laughing drifted in through the open door. Her headstone, carved by the grandson of a man she had saved, was placed under the shade of a cottonwood tree. It said, simply, Agnes. She fed us. Her legacy was not in the stone, but in the knowledge. During the Great Blizzard of '83, the food from her cellar sustained 12 families. It saved 43 people, 17 of them children. Her teachings ensured that when another blizzard, just as fierce, hit a decade later, not a single life was lost to hunger or cold. You have a space in your life that the world has told you is barren. A dismissed idea. A quiet obsession. You have been standing outside the cave, feeling the cold wind, when the earth beneath your feet has been offering a different season all along. What stone have you refused to lift? What door have you sealed yourself, believing it was a tomb when it was, in fact, a seedbed. Those 3 red tomatoes, growing in the heart of a blizzard, were not a miracle. They were the harvest of a mind that refused to believe the weather was the only truth. We tell stories about the quiet architects of survival. Subscribe to witness more.